If you have been following the channel for a long time, you might know that the first ever video that I uploaded was about the Death Guard Terminator in green armor. But a lot has happened since then. The channel is almost a year old and there are thousands of subscribers, which I never imagined would happen, so thank you very much for that support. So I thought it would be good to revisit this theme again and see what I can do with the Death Guards now after a year, how much I actually grew as a painter. Can I do something that is better than what I did back then?
Hey guys, I'm Zoltan and you're watching Phalanx Miniatures.
So for reference, here's the model I'm talking about. This is what I painted a year ago and I still like it quite a bit, but it's quite desaturated and I think I could up the contrast quite a bit if I did it today. So instead of doing the traditional Death Guard scheme that this is, I wanted to do something that is super vibrant and super saturated. This also gives me a good opportunity to try out once again the scale 75 colors that I use for this one and I complained about so much, and see if I can use their quite unique properties to paint something that has a lot of color, a lot of vibrancy, but also a lot of contrast. So let's see how I did and let's start painting.
Instead of the usual black or zenithal highlights, this time I actually coated the whole model brown. I specifically used burnt sienna umber, which is a nice rich brown color. Then I used sap green, which is a really deep and dark green color from the artist range, to cover almost all of the armor panels with this. I only left some of the brown color behind in some of the deepest crevices and also some of the most shadowy areas, let's say the most downward facing areas of the armor. You might notice that I'm applying the paint quite liberally and it's also very thick, and that's because I'm using the scale 75 artist color range for this. When I bought this paint range, I was absolutely not satisfied with it because it just wouldn't cover anything. And in the meantime, I realized that that's actually a really good thing. Because sure, I need to apply a lot of different layers to cover something, but that also means that establishing transitions with this paint is extremely easy. Because individual layers cover relatively poorly and you have to use many of them, you are going to create a transition almost organically. And at the same time, you don't have to worry about your paint consistency so much because you can just use it almost undiluted if you just want to cover the surface. But once you achieve the coverage, the colors are going to be beautiful and vibrant, and that's exactly what I was going for on this model. Typhus is a pretty big model, so it took me some time, but this is how it should look once you have everything covered. And as you can see, the brown is barely visible, at least from this front-facing angle, but you would be able to see it if you looked really closely in the deeper areas and also from like a more downward facing angle. Alright, it's time to start highlighting the armor, and for that I'm going to be adding more and more of this brighter green color into my original sap green. Theoretically, I could use this new color immediately on the model instead of mixing it with the sap green and skip this whole step, speeding up the process, but I was afraid that the transition would be a little bit too harsh then. I will still cover like 80-90% of the armor panels with this color, but I'm already keeping in mind where I want the lights to come from. What I wanted to achieve with this model was a lot of contrast and a lot of vibrancy compared to my previous color schemes I used for Death Guard. And one trick that I found that can be used to establish really good contrast is to have a very obvious light source and highlight that side of the model more compared to the more shadowy side. That will create a lot of contrast just within the model itself. And with these first highlights, you don't have to care about it too much, but it's already good to keep it in mind to know where you are going to be placing most of your highlights later on. And in my case, I wanted to have the light slightly coming from his right, so from our left, where he's holding the weapon. He's kind of like facing the light. Instead of just having the light coming right from your eyes, right from the front of him, it would be a little bit to the top and a little bit to the left. And just like with the previous color, you don't really have to care about the consistency of the paint too much. I am just taking it right from the wet palette and applying it quite thick, and it still does not really create like these obvious layer lines that you would have with something like AK or even Citadel. But once again, this is because of me using scale 75 and specifically the artist range, although the normal range kind of behaves like this as well in my experience. If you want to use something like Citadel or AK or something like that, that might be completely different. And once everything is covered with this intermediate mix, I'm going to be switching to pure spring green. Once again, covering like 75-80% of the whole surface, but really keeping in mind not to cover the shadow areas anymore and mostly concentrating the paint towards where I want the light to be. At this stage, I also start to pay attention to edge highlights because even though I don't want to cover all the surfaces with this color anymore, I still want to cover all the edges. Just don't forget that you really need to go for full opacity here. So that means that you have to cover everything fully. It has to cover the previous color where you want this to be the brightest. If you are too hasty and you don't cover fully, you are not applying enough layers, that will mean that the color is not going to reach its full vibrancy. And in the end, that's going to add up more and more over the layers, and the overall result is not going to be as vibrant as you would want it to be. Also, don't forget to establish your transitions with this, because you don't really need that much glazing with this, like with any other paint. But what you need to do is you need to reduce the size of the surface that you paint, even with the same color, so that the transition creates itself basically as you move along. What I mean by this is that if you need, let's say, 5 layers to fully cover something with this color, then use the first layer to cover the whole surface that you need to cover, let's say 80% of the armor panel. And then use the next one only on 80% of that, and then maybe on 90% of that, and 90% of that, until you reach the final layer. That means that by the end, you actually paint much less of a surface than originally. The next step is to add a yellow, or like an orangish yellow actually, into our color. And why am I doing this? Remember that I really wanted to go for vibrancy, and if you add a white into your green, or you just go up to more whitish green colors, then you're going to lose a lot of the vibrancy, because you're covering up many of the previous layers, previous colors that were our midtones. And adding any white color into the mix to brighten it up will desaturate the colors, and I want to avoid that at all costs on this model. Then your next reaction could be, okay, let's add ice yellow, because that's what we usually do to brighten up stuff if you don't want it to be too desaturated. But even ice yellow has a lot of white in it. So in cases like this, the solution is something orangish, and that's what I'm going for here. As long as that color is brighter than your green, you are still going to get something that is brighter. You can use it as a highlight color, but because it has a lot of yellow and orange in it rather than white, it's gonna be way more saturated, way more vibrant. Other than the color choice, the process is exactly the same as before, but once again, we are reducing the size of our highlights and focusing it towards where the light should be. But remember that with the previous color, we already reduced the surface that is fully covered at least. There is a lot of transition there, but there is one part of the model or the armor panel that is fully covered. And that area is basically our boundary for this color. Try to operate within that boundary and not touch the previously established transitions. And don't forget about those edge highlights. They should go almost everywhere still with this color. I would not do edge highlights on some of the most shadowy areas and on the bottom part of the model as much as on the top part, because we want the light to be stronger on the top part. And while you don't want to cover any of the previous transition area with this color, you can still do little scratches and dots here and there to create a little bit of noise on those panels, because they are quite large. And when you are dealing with a really big panel, like for example on the shoulder guards, when a simple transition might look a little bit weird, you can just create a new reflection in the middle, right? And you don't have to care about too much where it goes, as long as it's in the light. And it should look something like this once you are done with everything. The next stage is nothing special. I just added even more of this orange color into the mix to brighten up the green even more. And by the way, if you think that that orange color is not even like bright enough to brighten up that green, how is it doing anything? That's because scale 75 colors are a little bit tricky when it comes to the color when they dry. Unlike some other color ranges where you basically get what you see on the box or on the dropper bottle, these colors actually dry in a very different color than what you would see on the label. So when it dries, that spring green is actually way darker than you would imagine based on the label, and me adding the orange achieves kind of the same color as you would expect when you look at the label. This can be a bit annoying, but you have to get used to it if you want to use scale 75 colors. Sometimes you have to experiment a little bit with the colors before you figure out what exact color they are drying as, because what is on the tin doesn't necessarily indicate what you're going to get on the model. Once again, don't forget to do the edge highlights and also to reduce the size of the area that you are painting, reducing it to the previously fully covered area. Also pay attention to not only reduce the area of the armor panels that you are painting, but also reduce the number of armor panels that you are painting, because some of them should not be painted with this color anymore. As you highlight up, start concentrating your efforts on the upper part of the body, the breastplates, the shoulder guards, and on the lower half only do things that are really in the light, like for example the exterior of the legs, for example. Also keep adding little scratches and dots here and there so that you help with the transitions and create more noise on the armor. At this point we reach the stage where it's not worth adding more of the orangish yellow color into the mix because it's just not bright enough. Therefore now we have to add the ice yellow equivalent in this range, which is vanilla yellow, I think, which has a little bit of white in it, but we can't really do anything else. So now we have to take that into account, that we are desaturating the color a little bit. And this is where I reach the end of the rope with my green. I just cannot highlight the model further by using green because it's just not going to be bright enough, but I still want to go further with my highlights. So I'm going to do the only thing I can, and I'm going to go to pure yellow here. I'm going to use the vanilla yellow that I added to the previous green and use it pure. The process is the same as before, but you have to be very careful at this stage with this color, because if you overdo it, you can make the whole thing look yellow and way too bright and lose saturation. Less can be definitely more here. Use this color almost like you would use white on a non-metallic metal as your final last effort to make it brighter, and don't overdo it. And with this done, I could basically call it a day and just say that this is good enough. With any other color ranges, I would do some glazing, or I could have done some glazing in between the different colors. But with this, honestly, it's good enough that it would be fine. But I wanted to go a little bit further, so I used the airbrush to strengthen my shadows, first of all, with a little bit of violet ink. I was using this extremely diluted because it's a very, very strong color, and I was also trying to precisely aim at the shadows and some of the transitions so that I smooth them out between the shadows and the greens. Because this is an ink, it's also going to have a shine to it. It's way more glossy than anything I painted here, so that will create some contrast between the glossy and the matte parts as well. Then I decided to go a little bit even further and have some blue in the shadows, in the very deepest shadows actually, and I used some contrast paint for this, but of course any ink would do. Contrast paint is essentially ink when it comes to this. Then I used Pistachio, which is this really nice yellowish green color from AK Interactive, to smoothen out the transitions on the highlights. Once again, I know this looks scary, but it's extremely diluted, so it barely does anything unless I apply a lot of layers, so it's really difficult to mess it up. Finally, I decided that I want to have a little bit of gloss on the armor actually, because it will have to contrast with the trim that is going to be matte. So I added a little bit of clear orange to boost the vibrancy even further and add a little bit of shine to the armor. Once again, extremely dark. Finally, I went in and re-established some of my brightest highlights with vanilla yellow because they were a little bit lost with the airbrushing stage. And with that, the armor was done, and I think I managed to achieve what I wanted. It's quite contrasty and it's quite saturated and vibrant at the same time.
And thank you very much for watching the video. I hope you enjoyed it and maybe learned something that you can use in your own painting process. If you did, please consider giving it a like and subscribe. It really helps the channel out. See you in the next one.